kind of made a beeline over to one of the clients.
Yep.
Did 11 years in prison. I could tell even from a distance that you really care about your clients.
Returning home is really near and dear to my heart. People are not disposable. It takes a lot to build trust, and once you've built that trust, you want to make sure that you can deliver.
So a lot of the housing first has become housing only.
We don't support them, but we expect them to thrive, and it just doesn't work that way. The reality is when you don't invest in those things, then the folks in the community become disenfranchised. It's more expensive to kick the can down the road today and address the problem 10 years from now. And we just have to accept that fact and start making the investments. Yeah. This housing-only interpretation is a problem.
This podcast episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. If you've been thinking about therapy, or even if you're just feeling stuck, go to betterhelp.com/invisible people or choose Invisible People at sign up and get 10% off your first month. Today, we're going inside the Corporation for Supportive Housing with President and CEO Deb DeSantis. CSH is a national leader in creating and advancing supportive housing solutions that help people not just get indoors, but truly thrive. We also talk about returning home, a groundbreaking program for people leaving prison that we featured in a recent documentary. I'll add a link below. You will love this documentary. From why housing first works when it's done right to the power of lived experience in shaping real solutions, this is a conversation you won't want to miss.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
We've been setting up at conferences in Canada, here around the country. This might be the 6th one. We're doing a lived experience conversation. And the woman says, can I talk about CSH? I didn't know what direction she was going to go in.
Yeah.
And I said, sure. You know, I was a little apprehensive because I didn't. And she started crying, thanking CSH. I know from years ago, CSH SpeakUp, you're one of the leaders in the lived experience. And then we're interviewing New Jersey family homelessness.
Oh, yeah. And
we're talking about it. And they said, well, it's a CSH model.
Yeah.
Oh, this is like almost like, you know, paid endorsements, but it wasn't, you know, and we spoke at these other conferences and that never came up.
Yeah.
But it did here. So that got me wondering, because there's so much that CSH does and I don't know all of it. The public probably doesn't know. I mean, I know about the lived experience SpeakUp because I was part of that.
Sure.
But I didn't know the family homeless models.
Yeah.
So can you tell me about Corporation of Supportive Housing?
Yeah, I'd love to. And, you know, I think what you're helping to illustrate is that sometimes we're a little too humble in the impact that we're having. But that's often the way we like to operate, is behind the scenes and really supporting people. That's been a lesson for us over time, right? So we're a national, nonprofit, intermediary, community development financial institution. What does that all mean? It means that we're working across the country doing a variety of things. We're doing advocacy work at the federal, state, and local level. We're providing technical assistance. We're functioning as a consultant to developers, providers, government agencies, and we're also a lender investor. So that's the community development financial institution piece. So we will invest in the creation of affordable and supportive housing.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, one of our lessons, again, over time is that it doesn't work when we go into communities and we say, this is the way you should do it.
Right.
We've really have built out our listening skills, if you will, to understand that when we're in community, it's really about understanding what their needs are.
Yeah.
And just, you know, helping to support them create the solutions that are going to be the most impactful for them.
Yeah.
I am really excited that today's podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp because I believe everyone everyone should be in therapy, but not everyone has the access to a good therapist or the money and insurance to make it happen. I've been in and out of therapy since I was a kid. I was what's known as a troubled youth. Some of those therapists helped change my life, even if I fully didn't realize it until later. As an adult, anytime I had insurance that covered therapy, I took advantage of it. But the world's changed. Therapy is now as close as your phone. BetterHelp is making therapy more accessible than ever. They're the sponsor of today's episode, and they're on a mission to help people start therapy more easily. With BetterHelp, you fill out a quick questionnaire and you get matched with a licensed therapist in just a few days. If it's not the right fit, you can switch, no questions asked. There's also journaling and group sessions built right into the platform. If you've been thinking about therapy or just feeling stuck and need someone to talk to, go to betterhelp.com/invisible people or choose Invisible People at sign up and get 10% off your first month.
And there's a program that I now love because we partnered on a documentary.
Right.
Returning Home is the name of the program and the title of the documentary. And it premiered last night. By the time this podcast airs, it will be online and there'll be a link in the description. So those watching and listening, you're going to love this. It's powerful stories that you wouldn't expect. But I noticed last night you kind of made a beeline over to Heather, who is one of the clients who did a crime, did 11 years in prison, and you were very sincere. I could tell even from a distance that you really care about your clients. And it's a marvelous program. Could you talk a little about Returning Home?
Yeah, I would love to. Returning Home is really near and dear to my heart.
That's what I saw last night.
Yeah, and it's something that I'm really hoping that we're going to be able to replicate elsewhere. And I want to thank you for helping us tell that story because it's an important story. And it's a story about how people are not disposable. So Returning Home was created to help folks who are transitioning from the prison in Ohio who have a history of homelessness and mental illness, and recognizing that one of the reasons the recidivism rate was high is because people come out of the prison with challenges and there's no place for them to live. And, actually, this was a little out of the norm for us because we don't see ourselves as a direct service provider, but we saw a huge need in Ohio.
Right, that's why I brought it up because you were explaining what CSH is and Returning Home is a direct service.
Yeah, so we saw this gap, but also the opportunity to work with several of the state agencies, the Department of Corrections, and at the time, early on, it was the Housing Finance Agency. But the idea was, could we kind of bring these resources together, and could CSH be the intermediary that's working between the state agencies and the provider community? And could we support everybody in that process to identify housing opportunities for folks coming out, and then understanding what are those additional supports we need to wrap around. So, I've had the pleasure of meeting residents of the Returning Home Ohio supportive housing program, who, as you mentioned, Mark, some of these folks have been in the system for 40, 50 years. I can't keep track of what's changing day to day. Imagine what it's like for someone coming out of prison after 40 years in a very sterile system, right? And the world has completely changed. And we don't support them, but we expect them to rehabilitate themselves and to thrive. And it just doesn't work that way. But the Returning Home Ohio program does. That's the outcome that is being achieved, right? The people that are part of that program because of the staff and not just the CSH staff. It really is the provider community that is providing that wraparound support that's helping folks really thrive in the community.
We tried to show that out of everything we do. We come from the voice of lived experience. That's our priority. And you know the other Heather. I've heard you know the other Heather,
Yes.
who wasn't here last night, but it's featured in the film.
I've actually been in Heather's apartment. She was very kind.
Okay.
We actually took some folks from Department of Justice.
Oh, wow.
They were in Ohio to recognize the Second Chance Act.
Right.
And we're really interested in the Returning Home Ohio program. And so we went to Heather's apartment.
Yeah.
We get to hear her story.
I don't know if you know the backstory, but after she did her interview, she was very self-conscious, and rightly so. Everybody is. But she's talking about some very sensitive topics. So we don't normally do this. We've never done it before. But our DNA is people first, nobody gets hurt.
Yep.
So
Really important.
Storytelling is important, but people are more important than the story, right? So we set up to allow her to screen it. We were doing a Zoom, and I could see Terry and Janae and Heather's face, and just seeing Heather smile, watching her story done with respect. Oh gosh, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to get emotional. And I got emotional because, you know, it's important that you like the documentary because you're our partner, but the people in it, they're the ones. And so it was a real important moment for me because it validated the authentic storytelling we do. And yesterday we did a podcast with all of them. And as soon as I said hello, I got emotional again. Just crazy. Because I heard through people that you knew Heather and you knew some of what was going on and you wanted to make sure that, you know, Heather approved her story.
Absolutely. You know, and you know this so well because you do this so well, right? You help to tell the personal story. And we know through our national efforts, and certainly one of the initiatives we have in LA, SpeakUp, is all about helping people to tell their story. It's powerful. We've seen how folks who are living this every day, when they're in front of a government official, an elected official, and they share their story, that changes hearts and minds. But that said, right, we want to be really respectful of how much that takes out of people, right? Because that, you know, they're repeating the trauma when they're telling that story, right? And so we have to be respectful, and we have to support them in a way that they don't feel like they're being exploited, because that's not helping anyone. So I think your documentary's done a really wonderful job of telling the story in a respectful way.
I followed, because it was just me back then. I'm one employee, but I can afford freelancers now. We followed the CSH SpeakUp to Sacramento 2 years, and then Washington, D.C. for 2 years. And what really struck me is how these programs give purpose to the participants. Because often homeless people are placed in an apartment and hopefully they're surviving, but they're not thriving. There's a lot of isolation. I've had friends that were placed in permanent supportive housing and no case manager ever showed up. The support wasn't there. And I also, when I tell this story, I don't want to show shade on the nonprofit. When I researched into it, the outreach person were older generation. So you remember Radar from MASH, right?
Yes.
Right. A good case manager is trying to, Radar's running everything behind the scenes, and a good case manager, a good outreach worker is going to wheel and deal to find whatever they can to get this person off the street.
Right.
So the outreach worker found an opening to an apartment, but it didn't connect to case management.
Yeah.
So it wasn't they were doing anything bad. It wasn't the nonprofit was doing anything bad.
Right.
It's just one of these things that fell through the cracks.
Yeah.
Right? But it's important, and it's something I wanted to talk about, housing first, which has such a negative connotation these days, because the support isn't always implemented.
Right. Well, I think your last point's really important, right? And I would start by saying, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Because the reality is, when it's done right, housing first works. When it's not done right, then we don't have the outcomes that we anticipate, expect, or desire. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of that play out now. And I would say a couple things. One, we're seeing some providers that are saying that they are providing supportive housing when in reality they're not.
Right.
They're providing affordable housing and maybe connecting folks occasionally to some services. But that's not what we mean when we say supportive housing, right? Supportive housing is supposed to be affordable housing with a more intense level of services that are made available to folks. And what I'm seeing is that some providers who say that they have embraced a housing first model are not able to deliver the housing first promise. And to your point, I think that comes because of a variety of things. And I would say, first and foremost, the lack of service funding, right? It takes a lot to engage someone in housing. It takes a lot to build trust. And once you've built that trust, you want to make sure that you can deliver what it is the person's looking for. What we're seeing now is that some organizations, because they don't have the resources, aren't able to deliver on the promise of housing first. And so what happens is that then the resident's experience is not a good one, right? And perhaps that person cycles out of housing back into homelessness. We don't want that to happen. But the response can't be that it's not, housing first isn't working, because again, I can tell you it does.
I can too, and unfortunately, the opposition, and there's a growing opposition, uses that against us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes for a good soundbite. It's an easy argument.
They cherry pick the data instead of telling the whole story.
Sure. And the reality is, if you really care about people, if you really care about building community, then it's not about saying this doesn't work. It's about understanding why it's not working.
And how we can fix it if it's broken.
And if you're criticizing this model and putting something else forward, what I'm seeing is those other things that are being offered as solutions don't have the same data research evaluation that Housing First does to say, no, this does work. Yeah. Now, I want to be clear, and I'm not saying, one thing fits everyone, because that's not the case. But for a majority of people who are experiencing chronic homelessness, Housing First does work, can work, and we should continue to invest in it at the level it needs to be invested in.
Amen. I consider myself lucky because, I worked as an executive in the television industry, so I know how to tie a Windsor knot. And then I...
and you know who Radar is.
Yeah, well, that's age. Our producers are younger. They probably don't know who Radar is. We were doing some...
I'm just prematurely gray, Mark, just so you understand.
And I know how to dumpster dive because I was homeless. And then after homelessness, I ended up working in the homeless sector as an outreach case manager and a family case manager. I'm now using my marketing skills, but I'm very grateful that I was homeless, but I also saw the other side. And to your point, illustrating in a story, there was a homeless veteran. His name is Lanny. He was drinking himself to death because his wife died. He was Air Force intelligent, really smart man. When Glendale police called us, he was in an abandoned building sitting in his own feces. And I was the first to show up. First, we got him into a shower, took him to the emergency winter shelter, which was operating at the time, which he didn't stay. I don't blame him. People don't understand that.
We hear that all the time.
You know what I mean? And it took a long time for us to get him into housing, but it eventually happened. And he was drinking himself to death. He would often blow 0.49. He was in and out of the hospital all the time. And all of a sudden, he gets his own apartment. And he started walking every day. There was no treatment needed. Some people need treatment, but Lanny didn't. He had an occasional beer, but so did my mom, right? But one of the things, I'm divorced with no goldfish. I don't have any kids. So I used to visit Lanny in the hospital. I visited him every day for about 6 months in his home and on my own. And the nonprofit I work for, which I thought was wonderful, didn't have the staff or resources.
Yeah.
And I believe me visiting helped a lot.
Yeah.
And to your point, the resources weren't there because really they have everybody show up once a month. They couldn't go do house visits. And it's not that they're bad. I'm sure the executive director, if they could have raised the money, would have done so much more.
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to go a little off topic here, but, I worry about this example you're sharing of Lenny.
Yeah.
Because I think there is power in community, right? And I think community can be a real healing force. And what I see now is that community is held in someone's hand, right? It's a cell phone, right? It's a smartphone. And I worry about future generations that don't have those connections in their community. They don't have the Mark showing up to knock on your door and say, how's it going? And we're not investing in the staff or the resources, right, to fill those gaps where community is changing dramatically. And I think that's what we're trying to convince elected officials of, government folks of, is that, it might sound like an expensive price tag. Oh, we've got to create housing and we've got to invest in services. But the reality is when you don't invest in those things, then the folks in the community become disenfranchised. And, it's more expensive to kick the can down the road today and address the problem 10 years from now. And we just have to accept that fact and start making the investments.
Yeah. Politicians are looking to the end of their term, not down the road often. You may or may not know this. We run an online support group.
No, I didn't know that.
To fight that isolation.
Nice.
There's about 2,000 homeless and formerly homeless. Many of them are CSH SpeakUp members. And it's because I saw that service providers were not able to provide that tangible social interaction. And I want to clarify, it'd be better if they could knock on the door. I maybe I'm still old school, radar, but I think the interpersonal relationships face to face, that's why we do these podcasts this way instead of over Zoom, so much more personable.
Yeah. And let me be clear. I think there are things that our field could be doing, like telehealth, some of what you're talking about. I think we could be using those things to create a better experience for residents. But at the same time, I don't want to negate the need to have more staff that have that connection to folks.
I did a TEDx on just that, on how we could, we do everything from our phone, whether it be, get your plane ticket, make a doctor registration, talk to your doctor now, and we could do that for almost the same amount of people. I could talk about this forever, but I want to get back to another thing that I'm seeing happen. And I live in Los Angeles, so that's often my lens, is many communities, because as homelessness has gotten worse, politicians are being pressured and they want to get up the numbers. So a lot of the housing first has become housing only instead of, and the politicians are pushing, we've got to get the numbers, get them into housing, and the support isn't there. And we did a documentary on Hennepin County, which I thought was really wonderful because they connected their support to their developers. So if they were going to do a housing program, they had their support services there to make sure the money was there long before they even started the program.
This housing only interpretation is a problem. I think about some of the work I did early on trying to engage public housing authorities. And what they said to me very clearly was, we can help house more people, but the population that you're asking us to house has service needs that we don't have the experience or expertise to address those needs. So we need to know that when a resident is in need, that there's someone that we can point to, that we can call, right, who's going to help. So that's this perennial challenge that I think we're seeing even more dramatically right now, is this lack of consistent quality services. And because we don't have that funding, what's happening is it's challenging us to get more people housed as the need increases significantly. And it's challenging us to keep people housed in the way they should be afforded housing to be able to thrive.
Yeah. I've known you for years, but we've never sat and had a conversation like that. We're both busy.
Yeah.
But I don't know any of your backstory. You said, you made a statement back when. So how'd you get into this work?
Yeah.
How long have you been doing this? What have you seen change? Because you've seen homelessness at the 30,000 foot level, which is different than, many others, people in the public see.
Yeah. And we've been sitting here for 30 minutes. I haven't mentioned that I'm from New Jersey. So really my career was in New Jersey before it was, running CSH nationally. So I worked in state government in New Jersey. I ran the state housing finance agency. So my background and interest is really in affordable housing. And came to CSH because I was just so impressed with how the organization approached this behemoth of an issue in not only taking we need to do this for the moral argument, but I thought the organization did a wonderful job of making the business case. And as a person in government, that was very attractive to me. I'm like, I could take that business case and I can get my other agency partners really interested in this. And so when I left government, there was an opportunity to join CSH, and I jumped on that and then became CEO years later. And a couple things have changed, but I'll just name a few. But for the longest time, I can remember being in conversations in different rooms, where the conversation was focused on reentry or child welfare or the healthcare needs of folks, and no one was talking about housing. And I'd be raising my hand, going, "How about housing? No, that's nice, but we're like that." Now you go into those same rooms, and the first thing people want to talk about is housing, right? And I think we've seen that in some of the kind of national dialogue.
Is that a good thing?
I think it is. It's bad and good, right? It's bad because it means that the lack of housing is hitting more people.
Yeah.
It's not just the spike in homelessness that we're seeing, right? Yeah. It's the kids graduating from college and they're moving back home because they can't afford to live close to their job. It's presenting in a number of different ways, but it's become more of a crisis for our country. So I would say housing is front of mind for everyone now. That has changed dramatically. And I would also say the thing that's exciting for me now is, and you used the word thrive. Before COVID, CSH was doing a lot of work to understand, well, what does it take for someone to thrive? Because I didn't want supportive housing to become the place where people became warehoused. Right? So it's great. People got a roof over their head, but that's not the end of the story. We want people to be able to thrive. We want them to, meet their full potential, whatever that looks like for them. And so we set about to understand what that looked like. What are the supports? And we created a framework, and we said, the work we want to be doing now is not just about helping people get housed, but we want to help providers kind of reorient themselves to focus on thriving. And COVID hit, and everyone got focused on, meeting all the new challenges.
Yeah.
Now, I think I'm in these conversations where lots of folks are talking about thriving. And I think that's so powerful.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it's exciting. And, CSH, I know we have to get back in that, and I want to be a driver of that.
Well, that is, and I speak about this a lot because, we started amplifying the voice of homeless people back in 2008. And so now lived experience is this really cool thing. And I try to explain to people, if you're having a lived experience committee, you're trying to get something out of them. But keep in mind, you need to put into them. And that's part of the purpose. Because I know the couple of years that I was working with CSH SpeakUp, they loved it. It gave them purpose. It gave them something to do. It helped transform their life. I saw it with Heather last night.
Yeah.
Because, you could see just from when we first met her to when she watched the film to how she was talking, it gave her purpose. So we have to give people purpose.
Yeah. And you said this earlier, I think, but we're still evolving as an organization in how we think about engaging and involving people with lived experience. Still learning a lot. But for us, it has never been about, let's check the box. Okay, somebody told us we had to have someone with lived experience and check the box because Heather's sitting at the table. Nobody benefits from that. Heather doesn't, and our organization doesn't. So we've put a lot of effort into it. It takes a lot of effort, right? Because you want to make sure that the person that you've invited into the work, into the conversations, feels comfortable, feels respected, and recognizes that the environment is a safe space for them to make contributions. And I will tell you, I've been in conversations. We have a national advisory board called One Roof, and it is national experts in our child welfare and housing work, and it's several leads of foundations. And we have a child welfare fellow that participates in that. And I remember her first meeting, and we were having a conversation, and everyone thought they knew what they were talking about, and she piped in. And we all pushed back in our seats, went, oh, yeah, that's right? And took the conversation in a completely different direction. And we learned so much from her in that moment that we came away thinking differently about our approach. So that, I think, that's what we're trying to do. Right. That's the table we're trying to set, and learning from other organizations how they're doing that, but also, most importantly, learning from the folks with lived experience and how to make that a meaningful engagement for them.
For those watching and listening that don't know and may want to know, the SpeakUp program pairs a formerly homeless person with a coach.
Yeah.
And they connect and learn how to tell a story. Then there's, different speaking events. And it is just a really great program for not only the participant, well, the coaches are participants too, but the coaches get so much of it, so it's really awesome. We're running out of time. I always try to leave on a positive. So what are some bright spots? What are you hopeful about?
Well, I'm really excited about the conference that we just hosted. We had about 1,400 folks from around the country that came to Chicago to learn from each other and share their best and brightest ideas. There was a lot of energy over the course of the 2 days. I honestly, coming here, I didn't know what to expect. I mean, there's a lot going on in the world that, one would anticipate that folks would not come in feeling real positive.
Yeah.
I think it was the complete opposite. I think what I learned was that folks are hungry to be in community with each other, and folks in this field anyway have a lot of resiliency, right? And so I take great comfort in knowing how resilient folks in this field are. But I say that also wanting to say I hope folks are taking good care of themselves, because I know it's a lot of wear and tear. It's weighing heavily on a lot of folks, the challenges and the changes. Yeah. But I feel really confident that collectively we can work through a lot of these challenges.
For me, it was last night. You had a premiere screening. Mm-hmm. You never know how those things are going to go. Mm-hmm. I talked to, producer Alex and producer Aaron this morning, a little bit last night, and it gave us all the feels. A lot of times when, and especially in today's media culture, it's all about the views. You got to get high views. You got to get the likes. You got to get all that. But it's not. It's about lives, and it's a different agenda for what we do. There was a video we did that only had 40,000 views, which is low for us and extremely, low for YouTube, but it changed healthcare laws in California. Mm-hmm. That's huge impact.
Yeah.
But society does, you only got 40,000 views. That's, So last night, and it's hard for me to put in words, but seeing how Willard and Heather and Chanel, who's the landlord, and then your team, and just how the film was received. And, I'm hopeful that it's going to have a lot of impact in getting other states to start doing similar programs.
And I think it has already. We had folks walking out who gave us their cards and said, please, will someone contact me? Because we want to replicate this in our state. So job well done.
Well, no, thank you. This is a partnership. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it.